Thank you for inviting me to this show. I'm really quite honored to be here. And I am going to be talking about how we locate the Islahi movement within the global selfish spectrum. Of course, we all know what the Islamic movement is, but I'm just going to give a brief outline of how I'm going to do this. Essentially, I'm going to provide some of the research questions that I'm looking at and the methodology that I had engaged with. I'm going to talk about the KNM, the Kerala Nadwatul Mujahideen, which is obviously part of the Islamic movement or is the Islamic movement, and its brief history. I'm then going to talk about democracy, secularism, and politics with regards to the Islamic movement or the KNM. And I'm going to talk about what current global Salafism literature talks about, and then I'll talk about the contribution of studying this subject, right? So the question that I wanted to ask throughout my whole PhD, and that's part of what this research work is doing, is how do Mujahid organizations approach the idea of democracy, secularism, and politics, and where does the Islami movement or the Mujahid movement fall within the global Salafist literature? The methodology engaged with was largely with interviews. I relied on a few videos and I also looked into secondary literature, largely in English, although I can understand Malayalam, but I am not fluent in the language. I'm not from Kerala. And essentially, a brief history of the KNM would talk about, we would talk about the Aike Sangam, we talk about Wakam Molavi and how after the rebellion there was this need for bringing together all the different Muslim organizations. That is what Wakam Molavi thought. And so he came about with the idea of Aikya Sangam, which was largely focused on reform, which was focused on education, which was focused on, even the Malayalam language as well. And of course, there was a lot of support, but there was also a lot of opposition to it. Towards 1936, the Kerala Jamiatul Ulama was formed again the Aikya Sangam was disbanded, and this was one of the organizations that was formed. And this was with regards to trying to go ahead and get ulama to the page. Okay. By the 1950s, they realized that it's better to get the Kerala to get like even everybody else within the fold of this movement, and so that is where the Kerala Nahdlatul Mujahideen was formed. While I'm not going to go and get further into this, there were splits that happened within the KNM, as we all know, Marcus of Dawa, Wisdom Faction, Damaj. I mean, there were a lot of different type of organizations, many organizations that came around as well, and a lot of them are functioning today as well, without, as far as I've seen, without much malice towards each other. So the big question that I had was that how and where did the Kerala Nahdlatul Mujahideen's ideas of democracy develop? And of course, Waqar Maulavi was one of the first few, major ideologues within the movement. Was somebody who helped shape the ideas of anti-colonialism as well as nationalism within, or to some extent patriotism within the forerunners of the KNM. And so in the 1950s, when you had the Jamaat Islam come into Kerala, you had the idea of, Jamaat Islam was trying to push the idea that essentially you shouldn't be taking part in elections or in democracy because democracy is kufr. Now, this is an idea that, of course, they later changed by the 1970s, 1980s. They themselves changed. But between the 1950s and the 1970s, it was quite common to have this view. So what they did was that they had a lot of debate taking place between the KNM and the JEI, and a lot of writers, a lot of scholars within the movements wrote on these topics to crystallize. And where the Jamaat Islam spoke against elections, the KNM supported the idea of elections and democracy itself, providing reasonings to the point that democracy is a tool like any other, and Islam is a religious system. Therefore, to be able to use democracy to, further the aim of Muslims is something that is not, it's a neutral tool by itself, and therefore we are able to engage with it. Now, of course, one of the suggestions or one of the examples that was given was that of Yusuf alayhi salam, where he was a prime minister, or he was a minister or a prime minister within a non-Muslim state. And so this was an example given to say that, we are allowed to take part within the political system, even if it's not a Muslim person, as long as we are here to try making the best use of it for the sake of the Muslims and for the sake of the community. Um, the other question that I wanted to ask about was how is secularism viewed in among Muslim organizations? And essentially, the idea is that secularism was formed in France over the last 300 years or so. It was formed in the background of the Renaissance, and the idea was that France was a place where the church dominated the common people, and so when the Renaissance came about, they tried to limit the powers of the church as much as possible and tried to limit the church from taking part in political activities, which is why secularism initially meant a strict separation of church and state. However, in India, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, there were debates taking part within the constitutional committees to talk about how secularism would be implemented. And finally, we came on to the idea of secularism being this, being this concept that would treat all religions equally, but would not limit it from the public or the political state. And that is how secularism is understood in India, theoretically at least, right? Now, the what that allowed is that allowed for all Muslim organizations to embrace it because, again, theoretically speaking, just like how we have a yogi who's a chief minister, you could also have, you can have an alim who's a prime minister, maybe theoretically. Again, obviously, this all depends on so many practical considerations. But what a lot of Muslim organizations did is they saw this as a way to coexist peacefully within India, and which is why they embraced it wholeheartedly again. And the KNM is part of the trend as well, which is where it considered that secularism was more of a way of, fostering good interreligious relations with other communities, and also of ensuring that Muslims get their due representation within the democratic system of India. So this is the Islamic movement's general approach towards secularism. And finally, with regards to politics, obviously, as we all know, there is a lot of engagements that take place with the Indian Muslim League, where some of the leaders of the KNM during the 1950s were also, they also helped found the Indian Muslim League, and they were also leaders within the IUML as well. Largely, the KNM has taken part as a pressure group where they do bring about certain issues that are of consequence to the Muslim community, and sometimes some of their members do stand for elections. However, as far as I'm told, there is no hard and fast rule within the KMM that we should be taking part only as members of these political parties or not. So this is the general approach of the KNM towards politics. Now, why is all this important, and where do I place this, right? Um, in current global Salafism literature, we have what is Quentin Victorowitz, who started the whole trend of classifying Salafis. So he spoke about how there are purist Salafis, there are political Salafis and jihadi Salafis. And purists being those who absolutely don't take part in politics. Then politicos are those who do take part in politics, but to change the system and make it Islamic. And then you have jihadi Salafis who don't take part in politics, but they do approve of violence. Now, over the because of 9/11, because of a lot of Western, problematic conceptions of what Salafis are, the problem that has taken place is that most Salafi organizations across the world are automatically branded as extremist organizations, which is a very big problem in Salafism literature. Some people did try to solve that, or some people did try to change that approach, and then they did try to bring about a lot of classifications of Salafists that were not only rooted in violence, but also in politics and in taking part in politics or abstaining. But the idea is that if Salafis take part in politics, it is to change the system and make it Islamic. Now, a brief note over here: the reason why I do refer to the KNM as Salafis is because obviously you do have a lot of organizations and a lot of people within the KNM who do tell that they also follow the Quran and the Sunnah, and according to the understanding of the Salafis Salihin. And so the idea is that they do what the Salafis do, which is why I generally treat them as Salafis when I look at the current global literature on Salafism. Now, post the Arab Springs, we've had different edited volumes, we've had different books, we've had different debates taking place on how some of the previous classifications of Salafis did not work out and that they were not as strict. For example, Francis Cavotota wrote a book in 2017, which was on Salafis post the Arab Springs, and he spoke about how so many Salafis had changed their views. Well, initially, many of them didn't take part in politics, many did move towards politics. Masuda Bano also spoke about She also spoke about how generally there was a lot of change in the approaches towards politics that Salafists have taken, and so did Olivia Raw as well. One of the main themes they pointed out was that there's flexibility within Salafist politics, and that they are more strategic in the way and not just ideologically aligned in on one position alone, but that they also strategically engage with politics, right? And that's why the categories that were initially produced by Quentin Victorowitz could be flexible. The problem that I noticed throughout all of this literature is that there's no examination of India, nor the Markaz Jamiat Ahli Hadith, which is in the north, or the Kerala Nadatul Mujahideen, which is in Kerala. And not studying these movements made a huge difference to the way that most of these movements are perceived within the literature on Salafism. So my take on this has been that studying the Kerala Nadatul Mujahideen contributes to Salafism and politics globally. It contributes towards the literature and the discussion on Salafist politics. And the trends that have pointed out that Salafists are generally flexible, and this was all after the Arab Springs. You would notice that a lot of these trends have existed in places like Kerala since the 1920s, since the 1950s itself, and that it wasn't something that has been developed, or it's not been developed much in the literature. We also can think about how rethinking categorizations of who is a purist, who is a political Salafist, and who is a jihadi Salafist exists as well. And I think also another important point is that to think about the impact of Salafist movements. Not just everyone talks about Saudi Arabia and its impact on Salafist movements everywhere, but we don't talk about the reverse impact where Salafist organizations have engaged a lot with Saudi Arabia. So you've even had people like Nasruddin Albani or some of his other cohorts who had commented on the KNM at some point, or who had commented on some members of the KNM, which is something that most people don't understand within the KNM literature. Sorry, within the Salafist literature rather. So with that, I want to end the conclusion, and I want to essentially say that there is a lot that studying the KNM or the Islahi movement in Kerala can contribute to. And without this, without looking into Kerala, we cannot give a full picture of generally Salafism in the world. There are many other places that are also not covered, but I believe that Kerala, because of its long history, its varied type of Salafists that exists, or the very type of KNM organizations that do exist in Kerala, can contribute very significantly to the literature. So with that, I end the presentation, and I'm open to any question and answers, although I'm sure the audience knows more than I do for this presentation. Thank you.